Hello, everyone, and welcome back for another episode of the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. This is your host, Howard Fox. The Outdoor Adventure Series celebrates individuals and families, businesses, and organizations that seek out and promote the exploration of the great outdoors. Our guest today is Phil Bloom. Phil is an outdoor enthusiast and freelance writer. He spent 33 years as a newspaper reporter and 10 more as a communications chief for the Indiana Department of Natural Resources. He continues to write articles for Outdoor Indiana magazine, the official publication of the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, and he is actively involved in the Outdoor Writers Association of America, an organization that I was introduced to back earlier this year. So, Phil, it's really a pleasure, and I say that from the bottom of my heart, to have you on our podcast today. Thank you so much.
Well, it's great to be here, Howard, and it was great to meet you at our conference in Vermont. And we met and talked over some meals there, and happy to be with you and be part of your show.
Fantastic. And when we launched the Outdoor Adventure Series, it initially, I don't know, the spark came from moving from the Midwest, and I think I lived just up the street from you up in Chicago.
Yeah.
And you're in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I've been to Fort Wayne at least twice, I can tell you that.
Yeah.
And when I moved out here, I just got very interested in the outdoors because as a photographer and someone who didn't care much for the Las Vegas Strip, I wanted to get out to the desert and just to be introduced to the outdoors and all the folks that made up this really fascinating, I don't even know if I would say industry, but culture, and then introduced to the OWAA and meeting someone like yourself. And I'm really intrigued by how folks got involved in the outdoor adventure. And so for our listeners in my little soapbox that I just stood on for a second there, I would love if you could share with our listeners just a little bit about your background before we dive deep into the outdoor focus.
All right. Well, I grew up here in Fort Wayne, Indiana, my home. Wouldn't necessarily say in a very avid family outdoor enthusiast group, although my dad loved to fish. My mom was great at fishing and got introduced mostly to fishing at a very young age, and then got into Boy Scouts, which exposed me to more outdoor activities and so on. I participated in that off and on for a while, but it wasn't that I got into outdoor writing until much later when I was working at the newspaper here in Fort Wayne, the Journal-Gazette, and the sports editor came back from a sports editors conference in the Washington, D.C. area. And he said came back with a lot of great ideas, and he wanted to talk to me about something. And I became last on his checklist. And he said, I want you to write an outdoors column for the Sunday paper. And I'm like, okay, why me? And he said, well, because, I know you like to camp and fish and hike and do all those kinds of things. So dabbled in that for a short period of time. And then I got promoted to assistant sports editor, and that took me in a little bit of a different direction. Then I eventually succeeded him as sports editor and was cruising along at that, managing a pretty good sized staff for a mid-sized newspaper. And we had a campaign that we were working on to enhance the Sunday newspaper. What can we add to that product to make it better and more appealing to the readership? And the managing editor at the time used to tease me about he had bought a Ford Bronco, and he said, "You and I need to go get in the Bronco and do travels with Tim and Phil," and teased about that for a while. But as I developed, the idea for Sunday was to add an outdoors page to our Sunday sports section. And it went back and forth for, several weeks, maybe a couple of months. And they finally said, okay, we're going to do that. Where are you going to find somebody? And I said, well, I'll do it. And they said, well, you can't do that and be sports editor. And I said, I understand that. And then, why do you want to give up being the sports editor? I said, well, I want to pursue this outdoors thing, and I want to do it the right way. We went into it with a mission that we're going to cover everything that goes on in the outdoors. We had freelancers who would write only about fishing or only about hunting. And oftentimes there was a lot of heavy editing had to be done to their work. So I said, we want to cover hunting and fishing. They're the backbone of outdoor activities, but we also want to do canoeing and camping and bird watching and all those types of things. So jumped into that in 1991. I knew there was a state outdoor writers group I knew there was a regional outdoor writers group. I said, there's got to be something national. So I checked around, and a fellow that I knew from Chicago Tribune, John Huzar, and John and I crossed paths in an earlier life covering Notre Dame football. And he said, well, yeah, there's a national group. It's Outdoor Writers Association of America.
Oh, wow.
And so I called, and that was like in May of 91. And Sylvia Bashline was the executive director. And she said, well, fill out an application and come to our conference in June at Niagara Falls. And so I went and got hooked right away, kind of like you did in Vermont. I met some wonderful people, got connected with other newspaper writers from around the country, and just been something I've just been actively involved in for the past now 30 years.
That's fantastic. I'm curious about something. When you were working in the newspaper, working on sports, being a sports editor, was outdoor activity like fishing, hunting, was that considered sport? Or was that just totally off to the side and occasionally there was a crossover?
Yeah. I think traditionally, if you go back and look at outdoors coverage in newspapers over decades, going back to some of the people, and I've been doing some research on the history of our organization and some of the people involved, way back then, the outdoor stuff was in the sports section. I've always kind of scratched my head and wondered, well, maybe it should be in the lifestyle section instead of a sports page, because once in a while I would write an outdoor story about a change in regulations for the deer hunting season. And they would put it on the front of the sports section next to a tennis match. And I didn't think they quite matched up quite well. But that's just traditionally where it's been. And I only know of one or two newspapers that have kind of pushed it over into that features lifestyle section.
How has the reporting of outdoor activities, and you provided the list, hunting, fishing, which are the traditional that come to mind, the canoeing, the camping, the birding, heck, there's even the astrophotography guys like me. So how has that evolved from your perspective in journalism, as really we've kind of grown older, wiser, you know, this type of activity is so much more accessible and available to us. How do you see that as having changed in these years you've been in, the journalism, and then eventually with the Department of Natural Resources?
Well, I think all of those, what you might call non-consumptive outdoor activities, the camping and the hiking and canoeing and all that sort of, the interest in that has always been there among outdoor writers, and they have covered those types of things. It's just that the mainstays were hunting and fishing. And some of that may have been because through hunting fishing license sales, the federal taxes that are applied to equipment that eventually goes back to states for their conservation programs, those were the big catalyst for providing the public with places to go and recreate, whether they're going out there to hunt, to fish, to camp, to canoe, to hike, whatever. And at one point, one of my performance evaluations, the goal for the next year was to make sure that 35% of the content I was producing for the outdoors page was something other than hunting and fishing. Well, I went back and looked at the previous year, and it was around 45%. So I thought reaching that goal of 35% was going to be pretty easy, and it was. And we covered a lot of things and had a lot of fun with that page during the time that I was there.
Fantastic. Now, when you started to write about the outdoors, and again, you had this mandate to kind of increase the non-hunting and fishing. How did you go about doing that with your team? And I'm assuming you had some writers that reported to you, maybe not, but you were out there as well. How did you begin to open up these other areas and begin to then include that writing in the work that was being produced?
Well, I think probably like a lot of my colleagues who were then at newspapers doing the outdoors copy, and some that are still there today in that industry, we were flying solo a lot. I know in the newsroom that I was in, there was two other guys that fished, and one of those two guys did a little bit of bird hunting. but there was nobody else. There was nobody to really bounce ideas off of within the newsroom. So that's why outdoor writing organizations like OWAA really became my newsroom, so to speak. So making friendships with other outdoor writers around the country through the organization kind of gives you a sounding board, and then you kind of follow their work, et cetera. And a lot of it was just trying to tune in on what was going on. I would go a lot of times to Indianapolis when the Natural Resources Agency was having their monthly meetings, bi-monthly meetings to set regulations and so on. So that was a way connecting with clubs. Like there was a trout fishing club in Northeast Indiana. There were, Ducks Unlimited, other groups like that were involved in outdoor activities, and they became great sources and resources for figuring out what was going on and what the topics were.
Okay. Thinking back with the OWAA, you started there back in 1991, and I know they're in their 94th year right now. So there was a huge history behind you.
Yeah.
They were walking the path. How did your involvement I don't know, come to the forefront in terms of your activity with an organization like the OWA? How did you had that first year, you went to Niagara Falls. That's not a bad place to go have a conference, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
How did this organization begin to kind of inform some of the work that you were doing over and above what you just shared?
Yeah, well, one of the things of getting involved was more just by coincidence. OWA has specialty sections. They have a section for photographers, a section for radio and podcasts and so on. They have a magazine writers and so on. And those specialty sections kind of get together at times and and they try and generate content specific to their work area to help improve the skills of others who are interested in that. And that's one of OWA's goals, is to improve the skills of its membership. Well, by sheer coincidence, at the Niagara conferences, when we put together a petition to create the newspaper section. So I was able to connect that year with people like Bob Marshall with the New Orleans Times-Picayune, and Tom Wharton at Salt Lake, and Bill Monroe out in Portland, Oregon, John McCoy out of West Virginia, who became one of my really good friends. And we created the newspaper section. And then I was asked to be on a committee with the newspaper group. And then from committee work, it's like, oh, okay, we want you on this committee. Can you work on this committee? And then after a while, they said, well, your name has come up as a potential candidate for the board of directors. Are you interested in running? So I ran. And I don't think I got elected that first year. And then they said, well, would you run again? So I got elected. And then I was at my very first, I wasn't even to my first board meeting yet. And Bill Monroe was the president at the time. And he asked me and one of the other new board members before our first meeting when we were going to run for office with OWA. Well, we both eventually did. I think we're a year or two apart. And I spent one stint as secretary. And then the other person that he'd asked was Jim Lowe, who was elected president a couple years before me. And then I was eventually, back in about 2008, elected president, and then, stayed involved, continued to stay involved, got elected president a second time, which was kind of weird because that doesn't happen very often in this organization. And so I've continued to stay involved and very happy to be part of it.
Very good. Very good. Now, I'm curious, you were spearheading this trek up to the infamous storage unit, right?
Oh yeah. Well, a couple of years ago, I had ended the second stint as president, so I'm now back relaxing in the recliner, and life is good and whatever, and no responsibilities, no duties. And I got a call from Paul Quinnell, who was president at the time. He'd come in the year after me, and he said the executive director at the time had turned in his resignation, was going to go do other things, and would I be interested in standing in as the acting director until they found somebody to do it full-time permanently. So I did. And as part of that, I found out from our do-all person at the time, Jessica Seitz, that there were two storage units in Missoula, Montana.
Oh
We
boy.
really didn't have a good inventory of what was in either one of them. So I made it a point to go out there. That was April of 2 years ago. I went out there with a brother-in-law and we emptied out the old storage unit and moved everything, the salvageable stuff. We shredded like 2,000 pounds of paper,
Oh
just
my.
old files that were of little or no, like entry forms from our excellence in craft contests from the 1980s, bank statements from way back then, just stuff that got saved that wasn't necessary to save. We saved what we thought was the important documents. We moved all that stuff into the second storage unit. I always had it in the back of my mind that I wanted to go back out and really dig into it and then clean that out because it's a monthly expense that
Yeah.
we didn't need. In August of this year, I went out. Pat Ray, who's a past president, came over from Oregon. Ches Chezik, who is our executive director, he came in from Cincinnati. Paul, who lives in Missoula, Kevin Rhodes, a member who lives in Missoula. We all got together and we cleaned that baby out. And I brought home a bunch of stuff to my house, which is eventually going to get passed on to Ches. But I got like somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 banker boxes of old copies of the magazine, some member records, lots of old photographs, and other materials that are of value to the organization.
Oh wow. So you're not charging storage fees, are you?
Not yet. I have two things in my garage that I want to get rid of. One of them is all that stuff at some point. The other one is a stack of leftover stuff from my daughter's wedding that a niece wants for her daughter's wedding. And I'll have lots of room in my garage once those two things are cleared out.
There you go. Well, you just be careful. Somebody else may have something more in store for you for that open space.
Who knows? Who knows?
I'm curious, of all the things you found, either from the first visit or this last visit as you were clearing out, was there oh wow, look at this type item or two?
Well, one of the funny things was on the I have a hand in the Excellence in Craft contest, and one of those duties with our contest is to prepare the winner certificates. Well, I didn't have enough. There weren't going to be enough to print for this year, so we're trying to find out who the printer was. Found out who the printer was, and on the certificate, there's kind of a raised and embossed image of a bald eagle. And I contacted Jessica Seitz, who used to work for us, and she said, well, she thought it was with the old certificates. Well, I had all the old certificates, but I didn't have this metal plate. So the day that we arrived in Missoula, I wanted to go to the storage unit and see what was there. And my wife was with me, open up the door to the storage unit, go inside and just kind of look around. And she's over by a box and she says, what's this? Within a minute of being in that room, she found the metal plate.
Wow.
So that was an oh wow thing, was that. But there are a lot of other things too. Lots of correspondence between executive directors and presidents and members. Lots of old photographs that are pretty cool of stuff. So what it has done is it's kind of given me some inspiration to try and put together a history of OWAA try and have something prepared for the 100th anniversary that's coming up a few years away. I've spoken to Ches about it. I've spoken to Pat Ray, who's chairing the ad hoc history committee. I've spoken to Bill Powell, our longtime legal counsel, and Christine Peterson, our current president. And they've all kind of given me their blessing to move forward with it. I have no idea what's going to happen or how it's going to turn out, but there have been some really cool things that I've been digging into and finding out.
Very cool. When I was going through university many years ago, I joined a fraternity, and I remember we were right around the 100th anniversary of AEPI, which was the university I had at Wayne State. And so I was the Xi chapter there. And at the time, it was the 100th anniversary. And that was like the big deal. And, for an organization like OWAA, I mean, that 100th anniversary, just given the folks that have come into this organization and what they have done and created, it's good. It's definitely an amazing story, especially those pictures, I would imagine.
It is. And, I think we've had two history books done in the past. One was done in the 50th year. One was done, I think, in like the 65th year, and nothing since. But one of the really cool documents we have is the founding document. It's written in hand. OWA was formed on April 19th, 1927. It was a group of newspaper outdoor writers were attending the Isaac Walton League convention in Chicago. And they got together one night, and they were upset with what they called the fakery of outdoor writing. And apparently there was some stuff that was being kind of made up by others. And they thought they should organize a professional group that would kind of elevate the profession of outdoor writing. And so on the back of this menu is from the convention is handwritten, "We the undersigned, yada, yada, yada." And it was signed by 7 people. Morris Ackerman, who was an outdoor writer out of Cleveland, wrote that. And then at the bottom of that, below those 7 names, are handwritten in a number of other names of people that they thought would be good candidates. People like Zane Grey, Nash Buckingham, who did become a member, and a whole bunch of others. But the one thing I found out, not necessarily in what I brought back from Montana, but just doing some other research, there was a mystery woman on that list of 7. His signature is Mrs. Hal Kane Clements. Well, in either of the 2 other history books, people don't seem to know who she was. And she's always been kind of a mystery out there. And through digging through, been doing family ancestry work. So I've got access to ancestry.com. I've got part of that. There's newspapers.com, which you can go into newspapers going back, way back into the 1800s, I guess. So I just started plugging in Mrs. Hal Kate Clements, and I found an obituary out of New York for a Hazel Clements. And it says that she was a newspaper writer and a magazine writer. So I continued to dig further and further, and I found out that she sometimes went by Hal, H-A-L, sometimes went by H-A-L-L, and she was quite a prolific writer. She was also a pilot and wrote basically a full-page story for the Chicago Tribune one year about her. She had gone to Canada and spent 40 days flying around the country with the Canadian Air Force, and she came back and wrote this massive story about it. And that's who that was. And through Ancestry, I kind of tracked, in the obit, I kind of tracked the lineage from there, and I've been able to connect through LinkedIn with one of her great-great-grandsons who lives out in the Northwest. And he says, yeah, that was her. And he has letters of correspondence that of hers writing about her travels. So of all the things that I've found so far, that I think is the coolest thing.
That is very cool. So I'm a very opportunistic podcaster, or individual in general. I should let you know this, Phil. If you have any pictures that you would like to share, for example, that initial back of the menu, or about this woman, or maybe in a picture of all of you standing in front of this, massive garage with all that history, I would love to have a couple of those images for our podcast episode.
Okay, I'll dig some of that stuff up and send it to you. Chezik, our executive director, has the actual document, the menu, and it's written on the back. It's got all these names, and when you turn it's framed, and you turn the menu over and look at the inside of it, take it out of the frame and look at it. It gives you the menu for the day and the speakers for the day. And the keynote speaker that night was Herbert Hoover, Secretary of State, who I think a couple years later was elected president. So,
oh boy, see, that's history, man. I mean, that's image of that would be fantastic. So I've got a question. You spent some time, obviously, as sports editor, the outdoors editor, and then you went out and had a brief stint with the Indiana Department of Natural Resources. You just didn't like retirement, and your wife kicked you out of the house. How did that come about?
Well, as 33 years in the newspaper business, you get kind of burned out after a while. And, I was thinking, I have no other marketable skills. What else am I going to do in my life? And I've kind of stumbled into jobs along the way. And this was the biggest stumble. The good friend of mine out of Indianapolis does an outdoor radio show. And I was coming back from the Outdoor Writers Conference in Roanoke, Virginia in 2007. And we had prearranged an interview, kind of like this one. And so he calls me while I'm on the road coming back, and we finished the interview. And he says, "Oh, by the way, the Resources Commission is meeting next month at Pokagon State Park, which is that's about an hour north of me." And this guy, in addition to being a radio host, he was also chair of the Natural Resources Commission. And I've known him through the state outdoor writers group for a number of years. And he says, and I said, "Brian, I'll be there just for you." So I'm sitting at a stoplight that day. I'm running late to get to the conference. I have got a pile of work back at the office waiting for me. And I almost turned around and went back to the office and skipped it. But I have two friends who live up near this park. And I knew that they were both retired DNR. And I knew they might be at the meeting. If not, they went to dinner late. I'd go over to their place and catch up with them for dinner. And I get to the meeting, and there's my two friends sitting over on the one side. And I walk in, and the director of the agency was giving his report to the commission. And he says, "Oh, one more thing." He said, "I'm looking for a new communications director." And my friend Paul, who was at one time deputy director of the agency, leans over and says, "You ought to think about that job." And I said, "I already am." So after the meeting was over with, I went up and Rob Carter was the executive or the director for the agency. And I went up, and we had knew each other from, interviews and stuff that I'd done on the agency for the newspaper. And I said, "Hey, what are you looking for?" And he kind of gives me the auto response, and then his eyes lit up, and he said, "You wouldn't be interested in, would you?" And I said, "Well, love to talk about it." So we talked by phone the next day, went through the interview process, got hired. And it was kind of a breath of fresh air to shift into a job that I could embrace. I always thought about public relations, but what happens when you don't believe in your product and you're stuck? Well, I went from the newspaper where I had support, but I didn't have any colleagues who hiked and fished and camped and did that sort of thing, to an agency where I had lots of people who did all those types of things. And I had a great staff, and it was a wonderful time there, and really appreciated the opportunity.
Fantastic. Now, are you still writing articles for the Outdoor Indiana magazine?
Yes, every once in a while, one of my assistants is who was assistant director when I was there, still there. He will get a hold of me from time to time when they've got a story they need written. And I do about, one or two a year, maybe. And it always kind of takes a little while to knock the rust off and get some stuff done. But I appreciate that opportunity to write. And I think, he must appreciate it too, because he keeps asking me. So,
You know, that's that's when you know you're doing things right.
yeah, I guess so. I
Yeah.
guess so. Either that or they're desperate.
Okay. Now, I understand you've written a book.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's hear about that.
Let me see if I can grab a copy of it here. And this came through OWAA. I'm Kay Ellerhoff, longtime friend in OWAA, and I had connected with her. She's out of Montana, and she was editing a magazine that was the Wild Outdoor World, WOW magazine. It was a kids-oriented magazine about nature and the outdoors and so on. And she was at one of our conferences, and she was there for Falcon Publishing. And I just sat down to talk with her, and she said, "Do you ever think about writing a book?" And I said, "Well, all writers think about writing a book." And she said, "Well, let me look and see what we've got here. Got some needs." She was representing Falcon, and she said, "Would you be interested in writing a hiking book about Indiana?" I said, "Well, sure, I could do that." So that was in I want to say about 1996 or 7. And I started to dabble in it. I took some time off from the newspaper, hiked a lot of trails all across Indiana. It's kind of a formulaic approach to it. But I tried to breathe some life into some natural history and other history into each of the hikes that I did. I kind of hang the tag on it that it was one of the first books published in the new millennium. So it came out in early 2000, and it's now in its third edition. which
Wow.
is very gratifying. And probably, I don't know, probably sold 20 to 25,000 copies during that time. So a little less than 1,000 copies. But
That's not so bad. That's not so bad.
no, no. And I really like the third edition because they took all the photographs that were originally black and white. They're all in color. The maps have all been redone in color, and it's a much snappier looking book and so on.
Fantastic. Well, we will definitely provide a backlink, to this new edition and include that in the show notes as
Okay.
well.
I'll send you a cover shot of the of it.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
So, one thing I've learned since being out here in Las Vegas and anywhere for that matter, even Indiana, which except for the dunes and having been to Indianapolis a couple times, I really don't know the state at all.
Mhm.
But I imagine that there is great hiking to be found if you look for it in anywhere, even,
Oh yeah.
you know, as you've just described for this book, how you're hiking Indiana.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of land conservation trust groups that have come along in the last, 25, 30, 40 years that have been able to go out and acquire property, protect natural areas, and it basically supplements what the state has done. And the state has a portfolio of, I think, about 500,000 acres with state parks, fish and wildlife areas, state forests, and so on. We also have a couple of federal properties, the biggest being the Hoosier National Forest, which is about 200,000 acres down in southern Indiana. And all of those places, including these small little pockets of local land trust, they've got some neat trails. And you can go off to even some of these little pockets and be away from the road traffic and be able to stand there amongst trees that are 300, 400 years old and, just get lost in the place. And it is pretty neat. I think one of the sad things is that at time there have been periods, probably like in other states as well, where the outdoor world, the natural setting that we've had, the rich resources that we've had, have been kind of neglected or abused. I think there's a really strong ethic right now to protect, and I think you're seeing some of that. You mentioned Indiana Dunes. It was in, I think, 1917, that Stephen Mather, who was head of the National Park Service, had picked the Indiana Dunes to be a national park. It was going to be Sand Dune National Park. But World War I came along, killed that idea. And it wasn't until just a couple of years ago that it finally, it was the 1960s when it was declared a national lakeshore under the National Park Service. And it was just a couple of years ago that it got elevated to national park status. So, and we've had leaders. Richard Lieber was a contemporary of Stephen Mather, and Lieber is considered the father of Indiana state parks. And he advocated for setting, very eloquent writer, and advocated for natural places for people to go and recreate and relax and enjoy the beauty of the outdoors. So we've got that in Indiana. We don't have the reputation of a Montana or of Vermont or something like that. But the backdrop that you have there, we've got that in a lot of places in Indiana.
I love it. I love it. And I imagine there's some nice, what I would call dark sky locales where you can set up a camera and take pictures of the stars.
Yeah, you definitely, definitely.
Definitely. Fantastic. Now I'm curious of the hiking opportunities in Indiana. Perhaps it's one of these hikes in the book. Is there one or two that have a special place in your heart with you and your family? And just like this, if you're going to recommend a hike for somebody to take advantage of?
Yeah, I mean, the big hike in Indiana is called the Knobstone Trail. It runs about 50 some miles over this. There's a Knobstone ridges in southern Indiana that were glacially impacted, and you're going up and down, up and down, up and down. And a lot of people have used it that I'm aware of to train to go hike the Appalachian Trail. It gives them not nearly the distance, but it gives them the up and down challenges that they'll face on the AT. Probably favorite hike that I've had with my wife has been I'm blanking on the name of it now, but it's down in southern Indiana in the Hoosier National Forest,
Okay.
and it's to the Two Lakes Loop. It goes around two man-made lakes, and there are camping opportunities on the trail and so on. And we've hiked that together a couple of times. Her favorite one is there's a trail over south of Lafayette, I think, and it's a natural archway where the creek has come through and washed out an area of stone, sandstone, whatever. And it's not a very long hike, but it's one that she really likes because legend is that when Tecumseh back in the early 1800s was attempting to organize a confederation of Indian tribes to combat the advance of the white man after his brother engaged William Henry Harrison in battle, and the Confederation kind of unraveled from there, that Tecumseh went there to this place to hide for a period of time. So my wife, being a bit of a history buff, really likes that place.
Very good. Well, we'll definitely provide some of the backlinks
Right.
to those hikes as well.
Yeah.
Couple of final questions, Phil. As you kind of look back on your career, what has been the importance of having mentors in your life to help kind of propel your interest in your career along?
It's very important, and I can look back at outside of my dad teaching me to fish and having a lot of fun, fishing with him as a young boy. From other ones, I kind of look back at three other people in my life who had influences, and I've thought about those three people a lot. And the one was my scoutmaster, Bill McCardle, who kind of taught you some self-reliance and so on. He flunked me the first time I took cooking merit badge, and I always teased him later on that he did that on purpose so he could get a second meal out of me. But Bill was a pretty cool guy. My first sports editor was Bob Hamill at the Bloomington Herald. At that time, it was called the Herald Telephone. Now it's the Herald Times. But Bob hired me out of college to work there on what he called a full-time, part-time job. And he's mentored a lot of people, but he kind of showed me through, mostly by example, to cover a beat. He assigned me to one of the local high schools in Bloomington, and that was my beat. And he brought you in to help coverage on Indiana University basketball and football and that sort of thing. And I can remember it. And then when I finished my last semester of college and was looking for a full-time job, I had two offers. One of them was for $110 a week, and another one was for $115 a week with some weird bonus tied to circulation. And he said, "Well, I think we can do better than that." And he made a call. He knew that the Bloomington paper was part of a small chain, and the newspaper in Bedford, Indiana, about 30 miles south, was owned by the same company, and they had a combined Sunday edition. He knew that the sports editor there was on the verge of retiring. So they worked out a deal where I went to work, and the two papers split my salary until the sports editor down in Bedford retired, and then I took over from him. I remember Bob and I, it's 1970, 75 or 76. Have to go back and look. The Cincinnati Reds were playing in the World Series, and I believe it was against the Red Sox. And the middle three games of the World Series were in Cincinnati on like Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday night. And Bob and I would connect in Bloomington, and we commuted to Cincinnati, covered the games, came back to our home, he in Bloomington, me in Bedford, each night, and wrote our stories, then did our work the next day, and then went back to Cincinnati the next night for the next game. And that was brutal. That was brutal.
You got to the World Series,
Got to the World Series. Yeah, that was the third one that I'd covered or whatever. Anyway, he was a great mentor and so on. The other one was kind of outside the realm of that, and that was a conservation officer, the lieutenant who oversaw conservation officers, game wardens, whatever they're called, different things in different states, in our corner of the state. And won't belabor it too long, but through contacting him for information about what was going on with the department and natural resources, he invited me to come to breakfast one time. And I went to breakfast and got connected with a group of guys. And then, and when he retired, I wrote a tribute column to him. And it was a confession that that his name was Ralph Taylor. Ralph is since deceased. But I said, I violated one of the tenets of journalism. That is not to get too close to your sources. But with him, it was impossible not to, because he just kind of drew you into his world. He really became a mentor in hunting. I got very involved in hunting through him. He used to go on week-long fishing trips up into Traverse City, Michigan area with him and so on. And so from an outdoor perspective, he was a huge mentor. Bob Hamill, great mentor from the newspaper side of things. And then Bill McCardle just getting me introduced to basic outdoor skills like square knots and things like that.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Phil, before we do our head out for this episode, we have a feature. It's called Insight to Go, and it's just an opportunity for our guests to provide one final insight. Could be a quote, a book, maybe a lesson that they would like to share with our audience. So for today, what's your insight to go?
Well, as a retiree, I get to do a lot of recreational reading now. That was different than I missed out on a lot of when I was, busy as a writer and reporter and everything. And I like to read mystery novels and so on. Every once in a while, I will read a biography. And not long ago, I read one on Father Theodore Hesper, who was quite a remarkable individual. He was president of University of Notre Dame for 35 years, the longest tenure. He's received something like, anyway, very highly respected, revered individual. And this fits neatly with retirement, but I think it's also a quote from him that is good advice for anybody wherever they're at in life, whether they're just getting started, deep into their careers, or retired. And he said his thoughts on retirement were do as much as you can, as well as you can, for as long as you can, and don't complain about the things that you can no longer do. And I kind of read that book after I retired, and I really kind of tried to embrace that, that I'm trying to do the best I can, as well as I can, for as long as I can. And there are things I can't do physically that I used to, but I'm not complaining about it.
Fantastic. Well, we appreciate that insight to go. Thank you. If our listeners would like to learn more about you and your work, where are the best places for them to go?
Well, we've talked about Outdoor Indiana Magazine. It's the flagship magazine for the Indiana Department of Natural Resources. If people wanted, they don't post the articles online. So the only way to get that, it wouldn't just be my stuff, but to learn about what's going on in the outdoor world in Indiana is to go to dnr.in.gov. And there's a way there to subscribe to the magazine. You can also buy it at many of the, Barnes and Noble and places like that. And then I think you have a link to LinkedIn. People can check in with me on LinkedIn and go from there.
Fantastic. And we can also provide a link back to the Outdoor Writers Association of America. They can, if they're into writing, journalism.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. We've got an open door for anybody. We've got a mentoring program, and we are eager to have anybody who's interested in becoming an outdoor communicator. It's not just writing, it's podcasting like you do. It's photography, it's TV work. We have artists and so on. It's a broad spectrum of professional outdoor communications.
Fantastic. And we'll also provide a backlink to Hiking Indiana now in its third edition as well.
Thank you very much.
So, and again, let me again say thank you to you. For our listeners, it's the day after Thanksgiving. It's Friday. Now I don't know about Phil, but I've got leftovers to tackle. I'm sure you do as well.
I've already done that once.
All right. That's right. You're a couple hours ahead of me.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me on the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you.
It's been wonderful to be with you. Look forward to seeing you in Wyoming next May.
You've got it. You've got it. All right, folks, we have just been chatting with Phil Bloom, outdoor enthusiast, freelance writer, retired journalist, former communications chief of the Indiana Department of Natural Resources. Really just a fantastic conversation about somebody who's really embraced what the path is laid out for him. I mean, just taking advantage of those situations, those chance meetings, and really made quite the career for himself. And, active member of the Outdoor Writers Association of America, two-time president. And we're definitely gonna have to track down Phil to get a couple copies of some photos. We'll put those up on the show notes, as well as some more information about his book, and we'll provide the backlinks to it as well, and the backlinks to the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, the magazine Outdoor Indiana. Folks, we hope you enjoyed today's podcast of the Outdoor Adventure Series. You can find us on outdooradventureseries.com. We'll also, in the near future, be back on Facebook and on LinkedIn, because everything is still pointing to the Success Insight podcast. So we still have those episodes as well. But we're also going to have these episodes up on all the podcasting platforms: Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Audible, and especially Spotify, where we have the Outdoor Adventure Series playlist. Okay, folks, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a phenomenal day. Take care of yourselves, your family. Enjoy the holidays, and we will see you on a future episode of the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. Thank you so much. Take care.